Welcome to our Bible study for September 1st, the beginning of a new quarter. And this quarter we will be studying and learning about and hopefully practicing worship. Our scripture passage today is from the book of Genesis, and that is so appropriate because this fall on our Wednesday night Bible studies, we're going to be studying the book of Genesis, kind of doing a grand overview of the book. But today we're going to take a deep dive into Genesis 13, 8 through 18. But before we get there, let me set the context. This is a story about Abram. Abram and Sarai will eventually become Abraham and Sarah, but this is before them. In chapter 12, God calls Abram, and Abram and Sarah get up and they leave their home in what is modern-day Turkey, and they move to Canaan, what is modern-day Israel. And Abram approves his faithfulness by uprooting himself in his old age, really, and moving to this new land to claim the promise that God has made him. However, in the 12th chapter, a famine comes into the land, and so Abram and Sarai flee to Egypt. And this is almost prefiguring for later in the book of Genesis and then in the book of Exodus, where God's people flee to Egypt because of a famine, and they have some calamity there, and so do Abram and Sarai, although for Abram and Sarai it is all Abram's doing. Abram gets there and he gets worried that people are going to see how beautiful Sarai is and maybe try to take her from him or maybe kill him in order to get her. And so he tells Sarai, "Tell everybody you're my sister." And Pharaoh hears about it, and Pharaoh brings her into his harem, and God is not happy. This is not what God wanted to happen, and so God sends a plague. And again, here we are in Egypt, and there are plagues, all of these prefigurings. And ultimately, when Pharaoh finds out that Sarai is actually Abram's wife and not his sister, he kicks them both out of the country. But in a sense, that's a good thing. And they leave, however, wealthy people, even more wealthy than when they came in. And they are making their way back to the promised land. And they are with Lot, their nephew. And he also is becoming very, very wealthy. And they end up in Bethel, and Bethel or Bethel means the house of God. Beth is house and El is God. Bethel, the house of God. And Abram had established an altar there before, and Abraham, when he gets there, Abram calls upon the name of the Lord. And nowhere in their sojourn in Egypt do we hear that Abram calls upon the name of the Lord. Perhaps that's why he got into trouble in Egypt, because he did not call upon the name of the Lord, but he does call upon the name of the Lord there, and in doing so, we assume he is worshiping God. He is relying on God's strength. He's gaining those things that he needs from God, and he's going to need them really soon because a fight breaks out. There simply isn't enough land to support all of Abram's flocks and all of Lot's flocks. And the herdsmen are getting into fights and disagreements. And Abram and Lot are at the very edge of getting into a fight or disagreement themselves. Abram doesn't want that to happen. And so we pick up the story in the 8th verse. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Well, as we begin to consider this story, let us be very aware that right now, literally, people are still fighting over that land, just as we see Abram and Lot fighting over the land. And we are praying for a ceasefire in Israel and in Gaza. We're praying for the hostages to be returned, and we're praying for peace to return to that region. But part of the reason that there isn't peace there, particularly shalom, the peace of God, and Jerusalem is to be the city of peace. One of the reasons there isn't peace there, I think, is that everyone is looking out perhaps more for their own interests than for the interests of others and for the interests of all. But that's not really what we see in this story. Abram's men and Lot's men are fighting, and they're looking out after their own interests. And there's about to be this fight between Abram and Lot. And so what does Abram do? Well, they're up in the hill country, which would have been rather arid, actually, up in the hills. Israel is a rather arid land, and the Jordan River flows through Israel. And that is this wonderful, lush, green strip through this rather arid land. And Abram tells Lot to look to the north and the south. You look to the right and to the left, and they would have been facing east toward the Jordan, because everything in Israel is focused on the Jordan. And so he says, if you look to the north, you're looking. If you look to the left, you're looking to the north. If you look to the right, you're looking to the south. You choose. What do you want? And Lot, and what Abram is doing is saying, you get first choice. Now, Abram is the patriarch. He's the eldest male. He gets to choose, actually. He can do whatever he wants. And he could tell Lot, you're going here, and I'm going over here, and you can't argue with me. It's my choice. But he doesn't do that. He gives Lot the choice. Look to the north, look to the south. You choose. Well, what does Lot do? Lot looks to the east. He looks north and south, perhaps, and he sees nothing but hills and arid hills. He looks to the east. He sees that fertile Jordan Valley, which is much like the Genesis tells us, the Nile Valley as well. It looks like Egypt looked, where you have the Nile River flowing through the desert there. And so Lot says, that's what I want. I want the Jordan Valley. And he heads off that way. And Abram then is left really with the leftovers. This is not the idea of, well, it didn't really matter to Abram. You take one and I take the other, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. No, it really did matter. And Lot chooses the best part. And yet what we know is Abram is doing the godly thing here. Abram has called upon the name of the Lord. Abram has built an altar at Bethel, and he is drawing wisdom and guidance from the Lord. And what he's really prefiguring here is Jesus saying, turn the other cheek if there is a fight. He's prefiguring when Paul says, don't repay evil with evil, but repay evil with good. He is prefiguring the life of Jesus, where Jesus has the opportunity to bring down legions of angels to save him, and instead he chooses to die. He takes the lesser portion by far for the greater good. And that's exactly what Abram does here, looking to Lot and to Lot's interest even more than his own. Now, it is interesting, I think, and we should note that Abram does recognize we're going to have to split up. And so sometimes when we have disagreements, we have to recognize that you're going to have to go your way and I'm going to have to go my way. But even then, that can be a way of avoiding conflict. And even if we do that, it is whichever one of us is going to be the most godly. I was about to say my responsibility, but whichever one of us is going to be the most godly to say, but I'm going to look after your interests most. Even though I'm angry with you, even though we are arguing, even though we're in the middle of a fight, and I probably think I'm right, and you probably think you're right, I'm going to let you have the ability maybe to think you're right, and I'm going to let you choose whatever is best for you. I'm going to look after your interests. And I'm going to trust that that is the godly thing to do. And let's note that Lot heads off to the east. He pitches his tent near Sodom, and later, of course, that's going to get him in an awful lot of difficulty and trouble, and it's going to be difficult and a lot of trouble, of course, for Sodom and Gomorrah as well. There is the implication here, I think, that Lot had not called on the name of the Lord. Lot had not built the altar, and so he reacts selfishly, and that's going to get him into trouble. It looks like Abraham is the loser. It looks like the wily nephew Lot has taken him for a ride. But that isn't actually what happens, because what happens next? Lot goes away. He's heading off to the great land. Abram is left behind, and then God says to Abraham, we're up here in the hill country. I want you to look. And God almost sounds like he is saying to Abram the same things that Abram said to Lot. Look to the north, says God, and look to the south. Look to the east and look to the west. But God doesn't say, and you choose which is going to be yours. God says, I'm giving all of this to you. Abram is proving his faithfulness in the way that he related to Lot, and in proving his faithfulness and proving that he really wants to be a godly person. God says, you're going to inherit all of this. Later, Jesus will say, the meek will inherit the earth. And there seems to be absolutely no evidence that the meek ever will inherit the earth. It is the powerful, the strong, those that come in and take whatever they want. They're the ones that get the earth, but not in God's economy. Abram recognizes, because he's called on the name of the Lord, because he has built an altar and he has worshiped and fellowship with God, he realizes that doing things God's way is often taking the really long view. And it's recognizing that indeed the meek will inherit the earth. It hasn't even happened yet. That's not what is going on in Israel right now. And yet the meek inherit the earth. It may not be until the coming of the new heaven and the new earth, but those who are godly are going to be the ones who are going to find themselves blessed. And those who, like Lot, are selfish are going to find themselves in all kinds of trouble. So if we are faithful in our disagreements, in our fights with others, we need to recognize that God is going to ultimately vindicate us. It may not happen yet. It may not happen in our lifetimes. We're looking at the long game here, and yet looking at that, we can find it in our hearts if we let God give us the strength to be able to turn the other cheek, to repay evil with good, and to accept and believe that the meek will inherit the earth. Well, the last thing that Abram does in this story, after he gets settled in at the oaks of Mamre, or the trees of Mamre near Hebron, is he builds an altar to the Lord. There's an altar back there at Bethel that he had built way back in chapter 12, and then apparently rebuilds in chapter 13. And now he builds another altar, another place of fellowship and worship there in his new home there at the Oaks of Mamre, which is not all that far from Hebron, just a little north of Jerusalem, up in the hill country, in that arid area. But there he is, and he builds this altar. Now, our lesson writer in our encounter says that an altar's job is to help us experience both worship and fellowship. And I really love that. I think that's really neat, that an altar is a symbol of worship and fellowship. And the altar that Abram builds is not unlike the altar table behind me. It's a table, and there's no evidence that Abraham sacrificed any animals on his altars. That's going to come later in the story. These are more tables of worship and of fellowship. They are memorials, of reminders of God's providence, reminders of God's presence. And I love the idea that it's a symbol of worship and fellowship. We all love being at the table with people that we love, with people we love, and to have a wonderful meal with people we love strengthens our bonds together. Whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or just some random Thursday evening, that is a wonderful thing. And here is this idea that God is at the table with us. And of course, we call these tables not only altar tables, but we call them communion tables. And that is because it is the place where we come for communion with one another. The church believes that when we come to celebrate the Lord's Supper, the communion, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it, when we come to celebrate that, we are coming to commune with one another. We're communing with the great cloud of witnesses. All of heaven celebrates with us, and we are communing with God. And so indeed, an altar table, is a symbol of worship and of fellowship. It's a symbol of the communion we have with one another, the communion with all those faithful who have gone on before us, and communion with God. Now, this particular altar table behind me has a really neat story. This isn't First Cumberland's table. It's actually St. Mary's Episcopal or Anglican Church's table. And they are a new church start, and they are meeting in our church. And this is their altar table that they use in their worship here in our chapel. And the way this altar table came about is just wonderful. They're a brand new church start, and one of their church leaders happened just a few months ago to be talking to a friend of his who's a woodworker. And he was so excited. He was explaining to this friend all about this new church start and how excited he was about the new church start. And the woodworker said, well, is there anything in wood that maybe I could make that your church needs? And the friend said, well, as fate would have it, perhaps, and of course we know it actually wasn't fate, Father Christopher, the pastor, has just sent out a list of things that we're going to need. And he wants us to pray about them and wonder how God might provide us with them. And so here's this list, and one of the things on the list was an altar table. And that was going to be one of the more expensive things, I'm sure, on the list. And the woodworker looks it over, and he decides he wants to build an altar table for the church, and he wants to make it a surprise. And so I'm not sure if he told the friend or not, but the rest of the church leadership didn't know about it. And he goes out, and now he's got to find wood to be able to build the altar. And he finds out about a red oak tree that was over 300 years old that had fallen down in a storm. And he goes to the guy that has the red oak tree, and he makes some bargain with the guy, and he gets a significant portion of this tree. And he thinks the wood's not going to be great wood. It'll probably do, but maybe not be that great wood. And then as he cuts deep into the wood, he discovers very, very important, impressive, valuable wood. And he decides this wood absolutely has to be the wood that will be that altar table. And so out of that 300-year-old red oak tree, he built this beautiful altar that's behind me. And then he had to arrange to get it delivered to church. And so he called us up, and we had to find a time and a date that would work. And the date that worked was March 19. And again, as fate would have it, although we know it wasn't fate, March 19 is the feast of St. Joseph. The feast of St. Joseph, Mary's husband. This is the church of St. Mary's Anglican Church. But it's also Joseph the carpenter. And we see God's provision here in this altar. And we see how for this church, this altar is going to be a symbol of worship and of communion with one another, with this friend, with all of the saints, and with God. Father Christopher told me that one of the things he loves about this table is that the wood is more than 300 years old. It far predates him. And he says, and this altar will be around for centuries more, God willing. It will post-date him as well. Just as that altar at the Oaks of Mamre, which may or may not still exist, but we know about it, is still inspiring people, still bringing people to worship and to fellowship with God. Likewise, this altar table can do the same thing. Well, to finish up our lesson, I do want to mention one more thing. And one of my little pet peeves is when people misspell the word altar. This table, altar, is A-L-T-A-R. That's how you spell it. And sometimes people will call it an altar table, A-L-T-E-R. And that always bugs me. It's not an altar table, it's an altar table, if to put that emphasis on there. And yet, as I was writing this lesson and thinking about this lesson, it occurred to me that when we come to an altar table, when we come to an altar, an A-L-T-A-R, what happens is it has the opportunity, we give God the opportunity to alter us, A-L-T-E-R. Abram is in Egypt, and he makes mistakes, and he gets in trouble. He comes to Bethel, to the house of God. He builds an altar, and God begins to alter him into ultimately the image of Christ, even though Abram doesn't know anything about Christ, of course, at this point. Likewise, we have the opportunity, whether we are in a church or not, whether we're literally at an altar table or not, when we come in to worship and fellowship with God, we are giving God the opportunity to alter us. And may that be true for all of us.